This episode of Grammar Bootcamp covers a lot of different things, but at the center of them is the form, the participle, which we use in all sorts of different ways and which often is a source of great consternation among writers and students. So where's the party in participles? Well, that's what they're all about, right? They are all about giving us lots of things to do. Participles are one of the verbals. Now, these are non-finite forms of verbs that overlap with other parts of speech. Now, non-finite means that they can be used no matter what person or noun you're dealing with, right? Whether it's first person, second person, third person. Participles sometimes behave like adjectives, but the other two verbals, gerunds and infinitives, can behave like nouns. When you're learning a foreign language, then you typically learn the form of the participle because it's one of the principal parts of a verb. English has two participles, a present participle that ends in ing, and past participles. And these can vary in form depending on the kind of verb you're dealing with, but generally they end in ed or en. Now, what are the problem spots for students? Well, what properties of verbs do they retain even though they're not acting like verbs anymore? How are they used, and why do they show up in all the hardest and weirdest things that English sentences do? Okay, so what properties of verbs do they retain? Participles reflect whatever transitivity their verbs have in other forms. Now, what is transitivity? Transitivity has to do with how much else needs to be expressed in order for us to understand what an action is like. Transitive verbs require direct objects to be meaningful. These are verbs that have to act on other things in the sentence in order to be meaningful. Intransitive verbs don't. Now, why is this hard? English has lots of verbs that have one sense that's transitive and another that is intransitive. And one of my favorite words for this is ambitransitive. This really doesn't have anything to do specifically with the word, because the example I'm going to give you is effectively two separate words, right? Even though they look the same, they have radically different meanings. Megan runs every morning. Now, that's intransitive. It doesn't require anything for her to act on. Megan runs a business. Now, that's transitive. The business is required for us to understand exactly what she's doing. How are they used? Now, you will notice there are multiple parts to this. Part 1. Participles can help us express complex verbal concepts like aspect and voice. Well, what are these things? Verbal aspect has to do with the internal logic or the state of an action. It's not like tense. It's not when something is happening, but how is it happening? Is an action, for example, ongoing or progressive? Now, if it is in fact an ongoing action, we call that progressive aspect, and we use present participles as part of the structure to express progressive aspect. And these are preceded by forms of the verb to be. The professor is talking about verbs. Now, this is a present progressive. Now, the present part of this, the tense label, comes from the form that the auxiliary verb is in, right? Is present tense. Talking expresses this idea of progressiveness for us. Now, we can make this past progressive too. We could say that I was talking about verbs. Now, is an action over and done with in any given time frame? If yes, we call that perfect aspect. Perfect aspect uses past participles as part of the structure, preceded by forms of the verb to have. The professor has talked about verbs many times, right? I have done this all the time. People think that I will have stopped. That's why this is perfect. They think I stopped, but oh no, I keep going. Now, there are lots of other grammatical aspects that language and dialects can express. Habitual, completive, punctual. Languages that you may have studied, like French, classify aspects with an ongoing nature as imperfects, right? Things that we do in an ongoing way that are progressive or that are habitual can sometimes be classed together as an imperfect. So this isn't a tense, it's not a time, it's a state of the verb. How are they used? Part 2. Past participles, right? So we talked about present participles. Past participles are part, and we talked about past participles there too. Past participles are part of the English passive construction. Now, what's a passive? It is something that is distinct from active voice, right? When we talk about a verb, we talk about its tense, the time it happens. We talk about its aspect, its internal state, and we talk about its voice, whether it's active and passive. And some languages even have a middle. Now, in active voice, the agent of an action is the subject of the sentence, right? This sentence that follows is active. The choir master directed the singers. Directed is a transitive verb. Choir master is the agent of that verb. And the patient, the direct object, are the singers. Now, in passive voice, the patient of an action, which had been the direct object in an active construction, is the subject of the sentence. The singers were directed by the choir master, right? Now, you may have heard lots of things about don't use passive voice or use passive voice in particular contexts. Passive voice helps us to regulate our attention in our writing. Who are we focused on? Who are we thinking about? Now, passives can go through all the same distinctions of tense and aspect that active constructions go through. We can have a simple present. The singers are directed by the choir master. We can have a present progressive. The singers are being directed by the choir master. Now notice what winds up happening here is we wind up with two auxiliary verbs, are and then being, right? Being winds up being the sort of past participial form of the passive auxiliary. It can also be present perfect. The singers have been directed by the choir master. Or they can be past perfect. The singers had been directed by the choir master. Now, often when we talk about these forms, the progressive and the perfect, we're talking about them with this idea of sequence of tenses. And I hate that phrase because in English, we really only have two tenses. We have the present and we have the past, right? Everything else has to be marked by an auxiliary verb. So what we're really talking about when we're talking about the sequence of tenses is whether or not an action is over or ongoing when something else begins. And how are they used? I promise this is the last one. Participles can behave like adjectives and provide more information for nouns. Now, many adjectives in present-day English preserve verbs that have been lost or are rarely used anymore, right? We regularly say things like, the experience was harrowing. Well, harrow, in its first form, means to lacerate or wound the feelings of, to vex, pain, or distress greatly. When was this last used in an inflected form, as recorded by the Oxford English Dictionary? 1623. Right, in Hamlet. It harrows me with fear and wonder. Now you'll notice in the 1603 and 1604, those are the bad quartos, quote unquote, right? So those are alternative readings of the text. And we can see exactly why the 1623 First Folio version prefers harrows, because it's verb. Horrors is a noun. I'm just overwhelmed, right? You hear this and say this all the time. Well, It's a transitive verb. It means to overturn or overthrow something. When was it used last, according to the OED, in an inflected form? The earthquake overwhelmed a chain of mountains of free stone more than 300 miles long. Now, sometimes people will say they find something overwhelming, or something overwhelms them. Right? So I guess that we do use it in the present tense more frequently than I give this credit for. Right? Now, participial phrases are really important, and notice I have a subtitle here, and why do they show up in all the hardest and weirdest things that English sentences do? Now, I said earlier, participles keep all the traits that their inflected verb forms have in terms of their objects and the other phrases that can go with them. An inflected verb with a direct object will have a participle with direct objects. An intransitive inflected verb may have prepositional phrases afterwards, so will its participle. Many participles can be understood as adjectivals that modify a noun, typically or often the subject of a sentence. This is from Jack London, one of his essays. It is not a flame of popular discontent arising in a day and dying down. You'll notice I underlined the noun that arising and dying is attached to. Now this sentence is a little weird because it's an intransitive sentence, right? It's actually what's called a copulative sentence because we have it and flame, which are reciprocal, which mean the same thing. And some participial phrases, especially in absolutes, act as adverbials, right? And what this means is they set up the conditions for an action to take place. So Harry froze, his cut finger slipping on the jagged edge of the mirror again. Now the difference between a regular garden variety participial phrase and an absolute is that an absolute typically has a subject expressed inside of it. Right, you'll notice that in the phrase arising in a day and dying down in a day, that's kind of borrowing the subject from the word flame. So now I have gerunds, a warning. Now participles, the adjectival forms of a verb, and gerunds, nominal forms of a verb, used to be distinct from one another, right? I'm talking here about the present participles. But they became indistinguishable in form. Now, how do you know when you have a gerund instead of a participle? Well, a gerund acts like a noun. Running is my least favorite activity. Running every day builds resilience. Running hard and fast is easier to do when you're being pursued by a bear. I hate running. So notice what I've done here, right? Running is the subject of the sentence in the first three, but in the second and third sentence, we've got extra information about time and manner, right? Running every day, and then running hard and fast, right? So you can have whatever additional phrasal elements that the verb would have in its normal form after a gerund too, just like you do with a participle. But you can also have it wherever else you would have a noun, right? I hate running. I also hate coconut. So coconut is a noun. Running acts like a noun. It's a gerund. So I hope that this helps a little bit.